Hi, thank you for coming out today. It's been great. How's it? Oh, I didn't turn it on, did I? Yeah. How's that? Yes, good. And I assume this guy is on too? Yes, good, good. This is being taped so they can make it available for online viewing, so good. Thank you. It's obviously a big thrill to be a local girl coming back, and I want to thank Dr. Dukas and his staff and his colleagues for making this a wonderful visit. I've had a lot of fun. So today I'm going to be talking to you drawn from research from the book. The book itself grew out of my curiosity about why in the United States it's so common to refer to patients as healthcare consumers. Why do we assume that we have to shop carefully for doctors, drugs, or insurance plans in order to get safe, affordable, and effective care? I just this summer spent a month talking about healthcare in the Netherlands, and I can tell you they find this concept of the consumer very strange. As I show in the book, our American way of thinking about healthcare has been powerfully shaped by the fact that modern American medicine and modern American consumer culture came of age at exactly the same time and have influenced each other ever since. We've had a higher volume of medically themed advertising in the United States for over a century. And American medicine tends to be much more market conscious than its European peers. You put those two together and you find the United States a country that has been fertile ground for the development of what gets called medical consumerism, healthcare consumerism. The idea that in order to get good care, you have to choose it very carefully. So in my talk today, I want to focus on one aspect of this medical consumerism that is on the rise, namely patient use of the internet, and provide some historical perspective on it with the hope of stimulating an interesting discussion. So let me start with two very different views of this e-patient revolution. The first comes in a blog from 2009 from a woman named Carolyn Thomas, who posted an article on her website, Heart Sisters, titled, quote, "What Doctors Really Think About Women Who Are Medical Googlers," a term she used to describe herself. And in her blog, she described how she became what she called the doctor's worst nightmare, namely a patient who arrived in her doctor's office having read up about her condition via the internet. Thomas explained how she became a medical Googler or an e-patient after an emergency room physician misdiagnosed her heart attack as acid reflux disease, a not uncommon mistake due to physicians' lack of familiarity with how differently cardiac symptoms manifest in women compared to men. After her close call, Thomas retired from her job working at a hospice and became addicted, in her words, to researching heart disease in women and sharing online what she learned with other women. Not surprisingly, Thomas's addiction, as she called it, affected her relationship with her cardiologist. For example, because of her persistent searching, she knew before he did that the Food and Drug Administration had issued an alert advising physicians not to prescribe the drugs Plavix and Wellbutrin together. Now, her doctor was not bothered by Thomas's calling this to his attention, but as Thomas noted, many physicians viewed this internet-using patient as a nuisance. And as evidence, she cited the 2007 Time magazine piece titled, "When the Patient is a Googler," written by an orthopedic surgeon named Scott Haig. Haig described the informed patient as the modern physician's cross to bear. In his experience, medical Googlers were, and I'm quoting him, often suspicious and distrustful. Their pressured sentences burst with misused, mispronounced words and half-baked ideas. As he wrote of one woman who refused his assessment of her knee condition, quote, "Susan had neither the trust of a nurse nor the teachability of an engineer. She would ignore no theory of any culture or any quack regarding her very common brand of knee pain." Haig got rid of her by referring her to a colleague, probably someone he didn't like. And among doctors, he said patients like Susan were known as brain suckers. Thomas and Haig's commentaries about the positive and the negative polls staked out in the last decade over so-called medical Googlers or e-patients is worth us having a look at. That debate reflects a dramatic rise in the number of Americans able and willing to use their personal computers, and now their cell phones as well, to access multiple sources of medical information via the World Wide Web. The Pew Foundation's Internet and American Life Project estimates that 80% of Internet users, so that's around 93 million people last time they counted, have gone online to get medical information. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Opinion is mixed. On the one hand, advocates of patient engagement see the Internet as a positive and potentially transformative force in American medicine. In the words of Tom Ferguson, one of the early pioneers of the e-patient movement, quote, "Individuals who are equipped, enabled, empowered, and engaged in their healthcare decisions can help us heal healthcare." That is his language. Within policy circles, where frustration over the failure of more traditional means of reform is at an all-time high, many look to this, quote, "new breed of informed health consumer," end quote, as the magic bullet to correct the U.S. healthcare system's flaws. And here's a wiki definition of e-patient that gives you a flavor of this optimistic view. Put the Internet in the hands of American patients, and somehow they're going to fix everything. As you might expect, this kind of argument has aroused resistance as well, particularly among physicians. And indeed, the medical Googler has become a flashpoint for debates about whether or not lay people can really be trusted to understand all the information they can now access. While reluctantly openly to question the official party line today about the virtues of patient engagement, these medical physician critics, often in private and amongst themselves, will express their reservations about the idea of the e-patient as a partner or as a watchdog. Both anecdotal evidence and survey research suggest that some, perhaps many, American doctors share Scott Haig's dislike of having to interact with Internet-savvy patients, a resentment that is reflected in the Google mug campaign. You can buy this mug at Amazon for $12, and there is a matching poster as well. The same animosity is expressed in cartoons. This is the source I came to appreciate when I was doing my research. I have a lot of these. Let me just show you a couple of these. The hairy doctor with the woman patient. I'm sorry, doctor, but again, I have to disagree. And she has all these things she's printed off from the Internet. I found out I'm dead and it's your fault. And here's Dr. Google. In response to these concerns, researchers are now trying to assess how patient use of online sources is transforming the doctor-patient relationship. And I'll talk more about their findings later in my talk. But before we go there, I want to draw your attention to one assumption that both the pro and the con parties to this current debate make. And that is that the Internet represents a radical break with the past. That prior to the Internet, as a sociologist put it, quote, health information was almost exclusively available to health professionals. And e-patients themselves often make similar claims. As someone wrote on Carolyn Thomas's blog, quote, "Whatever did we do before the age of the Internet, when it would take days of endless, tedious sifting through sterile medical library stacks to find anything useful to the average patient?" Well, I'm here to tell you today that the assumption that the internet created the informed patient is just plain wrong. Yes, the expansion of the internet with its sophisticated web browsers and links to multiple digital vendors of information is a truly significant development. But the fundamental conflicts it raises over patients' access to information, where that information comes from, how reliable it is, and how it affects their trust in their physicians are not new at all. There was no information desert before Google or Facebook came along. And in fact, when it comes to content, much of what patients find on the internet is not radically different from what was available in other forms via old-fashioned print and electronic media, including radio and television, or circulated through patient self-help groups long before the internet came along. Now, let me be clear here. There are aspects of the new connectivity that has come with the internet that we need to pay attention to, and I'm going to flag those later in my talk. But to recognize what's really new about the dilemmas that we face with this new breed of informed health consumers, we have to have a better appreciation of the ways that today's e-patients are following in the footsteps of previous generations of American patients. And I'll just bring to mind some of the older people in the audience will remember the 1970s and the women's health movement. The book on the left is the original copy of Our Bodies, Ourselves. That's 1971. As an undergraduate at the University of Kentucky, I bought that book. That's the 2011 edition on the right. It's been in press ever since it was first published. So today, I want to introduce you to some of these pre-internet generation of information seekers, the debates they sparked within the American medical profession. As I hope to show, greater access to information has not magically created new disturbances in the healthcare system. Rather, those disturbances have persistently fueled patients' determination to acquire more information in the first place. And my objective here is not to say simply, oh gee whiz, this has been going on forever, but rather to encourage a more nuanced view of the internet's impact. Because if you're not aware of the long-term issues and conflicts around the informed patient, we're going to respond to the dilemmas created by medical Googlers with simplistic fixes that are not likely to work. Now, I'm going to focus in what next comes with the 20th century, but I just want to say here, in case there are any historians in the audience, that this question is not new to even the 20th century. The combination of growing literacy and cheap print has made the United States in particular a fertile ground of do-it-yourself medicine, out on the frontier, having a handbook and trying to figure out how to take care of yourself. Americans have been big on self-help and popular medical education since the time of the American Revolution. That said, while it's not unprecedented, the 20th century really did bring in significant changes to the volume and the extent of circulation of healthcare information. There were sweeping changes in medicine, advertising, and mass media that essentially meant that with each decade in this 20th century, doctors and patients had more choices within a far richer and quickly changing information environment. And many innovations that were introduced then are still part of our medical landscape today. They've migrated from print to electronic and now to digital media. For example, physician advice columns, or articles about the latest miracle drug or the best diet, and lots of drug advertisements. This is part of our American heritage. So patients came to the doctor's office before the internet, having been exposed to the efforts of many different parties to get their attention. This is a slide of Dr. Dana Atchley, a clinical professor of medicine at Columbia. It's actually trying to show him talking to a patient. For some reason, they didn't have an actual patient around that day, so that is his secretary, who's been pressed in to pretend to be his patient. Now, if you don't know anything about the time period, you might look at that and think, oh, there's that little sweet lady demurely listening to everything that Dr. Atchley is going to say. But I know she may well have arrived ready to talk to him about the expectations she derived from a radio ad for an over-the-counter remedy or a recent article in Good Housekeeping magazine. Then as now, doctors felt like they had to spend too much time kind of clearing away all the underbrush of prior knowledge that a patient brought into the office. So if you root around in the popular and medical literature of the mid-20th century, as I got to do, I have a fun job, you will find a lively and remarkably familiar sounding debate about what to do with patients exposed to potentially misleading sources of information. Now, of course, unless the patient is unconscious, physicians always have to be educators. You have to explain to patients their diagnosis and treatment plans in order to gain their compliance. But for many reasons, that process of education got steadily more complex after World War I. Treatment moved from homes to doctors' offices and hospitals. Medical specialties proliferated and in the process developed new diagnostic technologies, procedures, and treatments. It would start with a specialty and then it would spread into general practice, just more and more choices available. Also, the nature of the diseases being treated changed. By the 1920s, infectious diseases like tuberculosis were no longer the leading causes of death in the United States. Infectious diseases have been replaced by cardiovascular diseases and cancers as the leading causes of death. Thus, the medical encounter increasingly revolved around conditions that lasted longer and were more difficult to cure, making trust and cooperation between doctor and patient all the more important. Now, given the enhanced evidence base and technical wizardry that American physicians began to acquire over the course of the 20th century, you think that the process of getting trust and cooperation would become easier. Like the Google mug, the message seemed obvious. Your doctor knows much more than you do. Just listen and do what he tells you. And to some extent, that kind of deference certainly happened. The mass media celebrated medical miracles such as antibiotics and the polio vaccine. Public opinion polls suggested that most lay people had a very high degree of faith in their personal physician. And yet the evolution of American medicine also provided fertile ground for the commodification of information, and information that a minority of patients started to use to try to improve their chances of getting the right care. Now let me stop here and say this was never 100% of all patients. And I'm just going to show you, this is a chart from Karina Van Noop, just on the level of activation. There are, and it's actually a graphic that works as well for the pre-internet age as for today. The folks who really want to be involved and in control were a minority in that time period. But for a variety of reasons, things were changing in the American medical profession that meant that the folks who were getting more activated, so to speak, found both a lot to be concerned about and avenues for exercising that search for information. This tendency of patients to feel like they need to get more information and to be more involved seems to have been higher in the United States than in European countries at a comparable time. Why is that? Too long to go in here, but I'll just say briefly, by the early 20th century, the American medical profession had acquired a great degree of autonomy, in part because of the scientific discoveries of the turn of this century. It had a greater degree of autonomy than its European counterpoints. It was also much less centrally organized and faced intense competition from alternative healers. Hence, it was essential that the mainstream profession, what today is the biomedical wing of medicine, it was essential that they court the support of informed patients so that they would make an initial selection of a doctor of the right kind. In other words, the American people had to be educated to stay away from quacks, which the AMA defined as an osteopath, a chiropractor, or a Christian Scientist. They had to stay away from them and learn to spot who's a good doctor. And to this end, the mainstream profession worked hard from the 1920s onward to inform the public about how to spot a good doctor. You need to look at their medical degrees, their medical society affiliations, and their hospital ties. You have to doctor shop, essentially. In addition, the mainstream profession faced a pitched battle to keep the American public from wasting their money on what doctors considered useless over-the-counter drugs and treatments. Modern scientific medicine emerged in the United States in tandem with a very robust consumer culture aimed at selling health-related products to anyone, and products that did not require a trip to the doctor's office. So at the same time the medical profession was trying to train Americans to go to the right doctors, they also had to train them not to buy the wrong stuff at the drugstore. And there's a kind of, I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail, the history of the drugstore, but it's just absolutely fascinating. The kind of Walgreens model where you have to go buy all the over-the-counter stuff to get to the back counter where the prescription drugs were, was a deliberate tactic to try to get consumers to spend their medical dollars on all the stuff that was at the front end of the store. So, in other words, your doctor needed to train you not to buy the wrong stuff when you went to Walgreens. You know, focus on that prescription counter at the back. Put down that bottle of Geritol and go to your doctor instead. Now, this became increasingly difficult. Some of you may recognize a young Betty White. She was doing a TV ad for Geritol. This was, you know, before direct-to-consumer advertising, you had Geritol advertising. What?
It worked for her.
And it worked for her. Yeah, look at her. She's like 96. That's true. In case you younger folk don't know, Geritol was a heavily advertised tonic whose ads the Federal Trade Commission fought for years to try to make more informative, got beat back for legal arguments, and in fact didn't succeed in rewriting the misleading stuff until 1976. But there was a fundamental problem with this idea of training patients to go for the right doctor and go for the good drugs, not the bad drugs. And that is, once you got people looking and thinking, they didn't necessarily keep their gaze on what you wanted them to look at. So lay people who were taught to be savvy shoppers when it came to avoiding a medical quack or a snake oil remedy didn't stick just with that. Some of them began to look critically at matters that the medical profession would rather they not discuss. And habits of critical thinking that doctors would encourage when patients were contemplating a Christian Science practitioner or a bottle of Geritol in the local Walgreens were not so welcome when they were brought into the doctor's office itself. Hence, the American way of medicine, with its emphasis on the importance of picking the right doctor and getting the right drug, created this strange complex. You wanted them to do it in this setting, but not in the other. What in fact happened was a critical mindset that non-doctors began to develop that started long before the late 1960s. Now, usually when you do a history of the patient consumer movement in the United States, you start with the late 1960s. But in fact, you go back and look, these kind of people worrying about getting the best care and double checking everything are there long before that. I'm going to give you a couple of examples so you'll understand what I'm talking about. So, let me start with the Great Depression. As part of a broader middle-class concern with getting their money's worth, that was a bestseller of the late 1920s, techniques of shopping carefully for items such as automobiles or radios became part of what educated middle-class people, especially in big cities, thought they should do. And this idea of you should shop carefully for an appliance began to shade over into the drugstore as well. The 1930s equivalent of a medical Googler would have been known by the curious term guinea pigger. It was a term doctors used to describe patients who had read one of the many best-selling books and articles produced in the 1930s by early consumer advocacy groups. This is the most famous of them, 100 Million Guinea Pigs, by Arthur Callett and F.J. Slink. This could be found in any public library in the United States, including, I found records in the middle of Iowa. They had a copy of this book. And essentially it was trying to train people to spot bad products. And there was a whole big chapter in there on drugstores, going into the drugstore and avoiding buying the Geritol, for example. Well, in the beginning, these, I'll call them consumerists, critical consumerists, very wary of messing with doctors because they were afraid of the AMA coming down on them. But they did start to apply some of these same critical skills to the doctor's office. This is a 1935 article written by a former nurse named Catherine Kellogg that appeared in Consumers Research Bulletin. And essentially it was an article trying to teach you how to get a good doctor. She starts off by saying, in shopping for medical care, it is necessary to be even more skeptical and vigilant than in shopping for food and clothing. This is 1935. Her article outlined a range of practical steps that patients could take to protect themselves from bad doctoring, checking the physician's qualifications before agreeing to treatment, securing copies of their own x-rays and lab reports so they could easily get second opinions, and reading up on the current state of medical knowledge. She said, by these measures, medical care will improve mightily under intelligent consumer demand. 1935. Kellogg's approach is strikingly similar to what your mainstream patient is going to hear about what you need to do to be on top of your health care. But in the 1930s, this kind of advice did not sit well with the vast majority of American doctors. And in fact, patients who followed Kellogg's advice risked being labeled neurotic at best or closet communists at the worst. During the McCarthy period, the head of the consumer group, Consumers Union, got hauled in front of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And they were a focus of red baiting throughout the 1950s. Yet because of their loyal subscribers, Consumers Union and its publication Consumers Report survived the 1950s and would eventually become a powerful purveyor of health information to this day. In fact, they kind of linked the Great Depression era to the 1970s. On the left is a book called The Medicine Show. It was a compilation of articles from Consumer Reports, 2017. This is the same Consumer Reports, if you like me, when I bought a new washer dryer, I went and looked it up. They were doing this for prescription drugs starting in the 1940s. The Medical Letter, some of you may be familiar, was a spin-off of this just for doctors. So even though 1950s critics of medical consumerism like to paint this impulse to question doctors as a sign of communist sympathies, In fact, American principles of free enterprise made it hard to swat down the idea of the educated consumer or to suppress news stories about medicine's failings. The critical views were not confined to guinea pigger publications, but also started to turn up in mainstream magazines of the sort doctors routinely stocked in their waiting rooms. So let me give you an example of this. The press coverage of the debate over unnecessary surgery in the 1950s. As the number of operations began to rise in the early 1950s, so did debates among physicians about whether they were all necessary. And in a pattern that would frequently repeat itself in years to come, and still does, what began as an in-house debate among physicians in medical conferences and journals spilled over and got picked up by a national magazine. In this case, it was U.S. News and World Report. This magazine had recently revamped itself to provide businessmen news you can use. That's still their motto to this day. And news you can use included the latest in medical developments. In February 1953, the U.S. News carried a lengthy interview with Paul Hawley, the director of the American College of Surgeons, which offered a disturbing insider's view of medicine's entrepreneurial culture. In this article, he described in detail on what unethical practices motivated by the desire to make more money, including unnecessary operations such as hysterectomies and tonsillectomies. Echoing Kellogg's suggestions in 1935, again, he's a surgeon himself, he emphasized the need for lay people to protect themselves by exercising greater care in their initial choice of a physician, to switch doctors if they spotted the telltale signs of unethical behavior, he gave them a list, and report suspicious behavior to their local medical society. Hawley's interview provoked an outcry from his fellow physicians that became a news story in itself. In June 1953, AMA delegates introduced 11 different resolutions asking that Hawley be censured for his statements and set up a committee to investigate him. Newspapers and magazines carried the story, the whistleblower then becoming the focus. Hawley remained unrepentant. It turned out he dropped his membership to the AMA, and so he didn't let it bother him. In the meantime, the unnecessary surgery story got picked up by another widely read magazine, Reader's Digest. When doctors complained about patients getting bad information in the 1940s or 50s, chances were good that it was Reader's Digest they had in mind. Now, Reader's Digest was no communist rag. It had been founded in 1922 by the very conservative DeWitt and Lila Wallace. And primarily the Digest depended on reprinting abridged stories from other magazines. Where it departed from that tradition was around health-related themes. They would actually hire popular science writers to do the occasional story. And one of them, actually she did a lot of stuff for them, was Lois Maddox Miller, a well-respected science journalist who won the Lasker Foundation's Medical Journalism Award in 1958 for her articles about how cigarette filters did not keep you from the harm of cigarette smoking. Well, in August 1953, Miller wrote an article, and I'm sorry, the poor quality, I could only get this on microfilm. Libraries don't keep old Reader's Digest hanging around. Her article, Hysterectomy, Medical Necessity or Surgical Racket, echoed Hawley's warnings. She wrote, where the hysterectomy is clearly needed, it is a life-saving, health-restoring operation. But, as she said, it's now become too commonly adopted. And as evidence, she cited surgical audits done in several areas of the country. And these were physician reviewers doing these audits that found in a quarter to a third of the cases examined, no evidence existed to justify the operation. Now, Miller, like Hawley, blamed women for pursuing the surgery to evade pregnancy or out of an unreasonable fear of uterine cancer. But she also criticized the willingness of surgeons to be so easily talked into performing the procedure. And again, her conclusion, it was up to women to learn to seek out good surgeons who would resist the easy option. Again, you might imagine physicians were not happy with this kind of article, which they felt magnified the profession's failings and undermined patient trust in their doctors. Sounds a lot like Scott Haig. But their complaints had limited impact because information had become a product in and of itself. Stories about medicine, whether it was the latest miracle drug or surgery racket, sold magazines, sold newspapers. And nor could the medical profession avoid producing fodder that could be turned into these kinds of articles by magazine muckrakers. As medical knowledge exploded and as specialism increased, so did internal variations in treatment and arguments about them. So when a journalist or a committed patient went to consult the scientific literature about a specific disease or innovation, they might well find that physicians were badly divided over whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, often along specialty and generational lines. The idea in the 1950s of the random controlled trial was in its infancy. Determining the scientific value of specific treatments was extremely hard. Even as better data emerged, unanimity among doctors would be hard to find. In the meantime, even the kinds of magazines routinely stocked in the doctor's office might inspire readers to come away with the warning, best beware, you need to trust and verify the doctor's advice before you follow it. This is all well before the 1970s, when my generation came along and started to push this even farther. In this pre-1970 phase of medical consumerism, the role of middlemen and women was especially important. So you see these science writers and popular journalists. They were typically white, middle class, and well educated. They knew how to elbow their way into medical libraries, take notes, and then write something up in a way that their fellow lay people could understand. What happened in the 1960s and 70s is that this quest for patient health information then exploded. And much more, the middle people are still there, but it becomes much easier for patients themselves to start going directly to sources that began to open up to them. I can only sketch briefly here the reasons for this 1970s information revolution, as some have called it. One factor is certainly the growing prominence of medicine and the pharmaceutical industry as business interests in the American economy, and prices going up, etc., means that their economic behavior came under increasingly hostile scrutiny. The various rights movements of the 1960s, civil rights, women's rights, patients' rights, fed into a general questioning of authority and medical criticism of medical paternalism in particular. Perhaps most importantly, the 1960s brought to maturity a younger generation of Americans who were both more prosperous and better educated than their Depression-era parents, and thus more willing to criticize what they called the medical establishment. As one doctor wrote of college students in 1974, they were, quote, a new breed of patients who would be far more assertive than their parents had been, and they were going to, quote, insist that you explain what you're doing. This new breed of patient in the 1970s proved to be an enthusiastic reader, spurring even more outlets of consumer-oriented kinds of health advice. Over the course of the 1970s, the numbers of health-related titles increased to about 1,000 books per year. New print and paper technologies allowed the production of better quality paperbacks, which in turn fostered publishing on more specialized topics, alternative healing, diet, nutrition, and the management of specific ailments. The health and self-care sections of bookstores grew dramatically as a result. Meanwhile, mass market magazine and newspapers continued to carry many articles concerning healthcare issues. Between 1970 and 1980, the pages devoted to health and medicine in the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature increased nearly tenfold. Compared to their 1950s antecedents, this 1970s literature was far more openly critical of doctors and supportive of patients' abilities to make decisions about their own care. Now that tone is evident again in Our Bodies, Ourselves, which I mentioned earlier. It's also evident in other bestsellers from this period, 1976, that's Joe Graydon's People's Pharmacy, and this was one of the most popular, more consumer-oriented, written by two physicians. So younger physicians started to get into this mindset of, well, take care of yourself. Went through a number of editions. As the author of a 1978 guidebook for sick people noted, quote, consumers, sometimes known as patients, are insisting with considerable success that they deserve not just a piece of the action, but a piece of the knowledge. And as a result, the passive role of the patient is passé. This print-based consumer health revolution overlapped with the beginnings of computerized indexing in medical libraries. Initially, that indexing was designed to help busy doctors, find the literature they need, but it turned out to aid patient consumer access as well. And you can see the National Library of Medicine's evolution. It's taxpayer supported, that they did the digitization to serve physicians, but found that patients were starting to come in and want to use those same resources, and they could not turn them away because taxpayers had supported that enterprise. Over the course of the 1970s, the idea of the informed patient moved from an outsider position associated with neurotics, communists, and Christian Scientists to a measure of respectability. And as other policy measures, and there are a lot of them, health planning boards, physician review organizations, a long list, failed to bring down prices and improve quality, politicians and policymakers on the right and on the left became receptive to the idea of enlisting informed patients as allies. The patient watchdog could be used to foster quality control in a medical world where innovation was frequent and professional oversight could be hard to sustain. And with the advent of managed care in the 1980s, fostering this so-called consumer choice in place of other fixes became an even more popular remedy. Now, I'll briefly note one of the ironies of this health information revolution is that it helped give legitimation to new forms of health advertising. That court rulings in the 1970s that advertising was a useful form of consumer information led to the overturning of voluntary restraints on direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription drugs. I talked about this this morning, as well as lifting of the century-old ban on physician advertising of the American Medical Association. Thus, starting in the late 1970s, a wide range of corporations with deep pockets began to offer their own version of patient information, and this in the form of advertising. And this deluge of commercial advice only reinforced the call for more neutral assessments of what was good or bad medicine. Hence, you get this spiral of information, advertising, more information to counteract the advertising, and on and on. This is the context for the 1990s discovery of the wired world. Far from being a radical break with the past, there are many continuities in the development from print to digital forms of information. I'll just point out, here's the beginning or the founding document of the e-patient movement. It was a book published in 1996 by Tom Ferguson. Multiple ways that this message was getting out there. And the policy position that information could serve a healthy corrective in a free market economy infused the enthusiastic embrace of the Internet's resources as a tool for this new generation of e-patients. So this brings me back to where I started. How does this historical journey I've taken you on help us understand the challenges presented by today's medical Googler? First, the long-range perspective reminds us that patient information hunting did not exist and does not exist in a cultural vacuum. but rather arose as a response to conditions that already existed in the healthcare system. In this case, patient use of the internet has reflected the challenges that already existed in the healthcare system. Doctors with insufficient time, doctors and patients snowed under by a tidal wave of information and advertising, a complex and often unequitable system of healthcare finance, and so on. Were patients perfectly satisfied with their medical care, they wouldn't be trolling for information on PubMed or alternativehealth.com to begin with. What the internet has done is made this hunting and gathering of information much easier, at least for people who are wired in, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Where I see the really significant change is not with the original version, but rather Web 2.0, as it's sometimes called, which vastly multiplied the interactive nature of the internet, the ease with which users can generate content and create virtual communities via the web. And it's this connectivity that makes web-based information so new and distinctive. And this is kind of gives you, the internet is the asteroid that kind of changes. This is from a talk by Lee Rainey to medical librarians. So what I mean by this is today you can not only click on a screen and open a static page of text, like opening a page of Reader's Digest or whatever, you can also connect with people reading that same article and interested in that content in a huge variety of ways. You can follow up with email, blogging, Skyping, and social media through Facebook or Twitter. To appreciate that transformative potential, consider the contrast with the original Our Bodies, Ourselves. This was a small group of feminists in Boston who had a consciousness-raising group, and this was the mimeograph that they wrote and handed around and then made copies of and gave it to their friends. Now you can do that online. One of the most powerful capacities of this connection is the capacity for peer-to-peer support and information exchange. You can even meet people with your condition on Skype. Sometimes I think there's an assumption that if lay people talk to each other, that they are invariably going to take anti-medical or unreasonable positions. But here again, I think the reality is a lot more diverse. If you visit a website, excuse me, like Heart Sisters, it in fact, the information is vetted by cardiologists, and its intent is to provide a valuable service for women with heart disease. This connectivity also has the potential to enhance communication between doctors and patients and among doctors about patients they share. So now instead of phone calls, you can get an email with your lab results. When you move from one doctor to another, presumably your medical records can go with you, and so on. So the potential for connection here, that could be really good. And this is just, they love to do these kind of charts, and it just, all the different ways that these things can get better. To be sure, making use of all this connectivity is not easy. Then let me just mention one of the most obvious problems, and that is unequal access. Even though the so-called digital divide, people who have access to the internet and people who don't, has narrowed substantially in the last decade, groups that we still very much want and need to reach, the elderly, people of color, rural residents, and very, very poor Americans, are still less likely to have access to the internet's resources. And keep in mind, this is the second problem, that in the United States, this information hunt covers everything. It's not just the choice of your doctor, but it's your insurance plan, your prescription drugs. So there's a scaling up of everything you're supposed to be informed about that can be really overwhelming. Now, some people assume because of that everyone who goes on the internet must be a wealthy, entitled person. But one of the factoids I found in my research was, in fact, a recent study showed that people who have limited access to medical care due to their insurance status are more likely to go online to get information just to try to make sure they can get some kind of care that they can afford. One final issue, or rather caution, I want to raise. In our enthusiasm for the new web, we need to recognize its kinship with the historic information environment. So when I, as a historian, this is the famous upside-down pyramid from Tom Ferguson's book in 1996, I see something conspicuously absent there. There is nowhere in this pyramid for advertising. There is nowhere for the access that the internet now has to show you all kinds of ads, including ads for direct-to-consumer advertising. In today's wired world, as Tim Wu has shown in his book, Merchants of Attention, commercial actors are well-financed, command great creative talent, and are relentless in their bid to bring advertising to every nook and cranny of our lives. There is no way that we can scrub this material off the internet, and it's just not going to happen. Let me repeat here my earlier point. The problems with all these new IT solutions reflect already existing problems. They didn't create them de novo. It's the healthcare system that's already troubled for reasons we're now familiar with, problems with quality, cost, access that lead to mistrust, rushed encounters, reliance on stereotypes, etc. And these problems are on both sides, with patients and their caregivers. E-tools are not a magic wand. We can wave over all the dysfunction of the healthcare system and poof, make them go away. They have both good and bad aspects, as all new technologies do, and we need to be patient in addressing those problems. We need to beware of writing them off with simple tales of how ignorant or neurotic patients needlessly bother their doctors, and instead probe deeper into the characteristics of our healthcare system that make Googling such an attractive option. What about solutions? I'm here to hear what you have to say. I'll just throw out a few ideas of my own. I don't think signs and mugs like this are the way to go. I think it's far better to recognize that patients trying to be better informed are here to stay. Far better to adopt the motto, if you can't beat them, join them. Skip the mug and work with your local, your medical societies, your medical librarians, other patient educators to draw up a list of internet resources you like and want to recommend. There are always going to be obnoxious patients, as there are obnoxious doctors, who will find bad ideas online to come and bother you with. But that should not stop us from trying to use the enhanced potentials of this connective internet to push back against the very real problems that exist in our healthcare system today. Starting with the relentless hollowing out and fragmentation of the time that doctors and patients spend together. There are a world of good ideas being tried out, and I've been very impressed, particularly the way librarians are leading the way. Physicians, nurses, physician's assistants do not need to reinvent the wheel. You can talk to your friendly neighborhood information professional, and they really can give you a lot of advice. The debate about medical Googlers is at heart a debate about patient engagement. With or without the internet, the ideals of participatory medicine are hard to fulfill, but what choice do we have? I look forward to hearing more about your ideas. Thank you.
For questions? 5 minutes? Yes. Hi.
Hey, I'm Kyle Brothers. I'm a pediatrician and ethicist. And I do some social science, but I'm not a pro. I love this talk. I think it's extraordinary, and really, really enjoyed hearing your thoughts about this.
Thanks.
I just want to turn attention slightly away from the source of information towards the culture that receives it. And I mean, you sort of started off with this point that there's a really strong narrative right now about how different patients are now than they were before. And I think you really convincingly showed that there were at least some patients like that going back a long time. So I'm just curious, where do you think, what's the source of this narrative? Is it that there's been a qualitative change in patients? Is it that there's been a quantitative change in these types of patients? What's the, why do we have this narrative, and what's different?
Why does it keep repeating itself? That a really good a good and kind of hard to answer. In part, I think we keep coming up with this because our own lives are short and we don't remember how it was. And the myth of a golden age of medicine is it just comes up over and over again. If you don't know anything about medicine before 1960, you might well think everything was great back then until these people started to talk back to us. But the further back you go, the more you see that these tensions were always there. Maybe that myth it's a protective function. It kind of puts it in the present where maybe you feel like you can deal with it. I don't know. It's a good question that I'll have to think about.
I would love to, Dr. Dukas, you're just a year or two older than me. Do you, in the course of your career, do you feel like there has been a difference, or do you think this was sort of it's been relatively consistent, across the course of your career?
I remember in the 1880s. I think it's been amplified greatly with the advent of the internet. That when I was in practice in the 80s and early 90s, I was less likely to have somebody come in saying, I've just seen this article on I Am Joe Stock. Reader's Digest used to actually have articles like that. And it was far more likely to be something when they were going to come in having seen something on the internet. And part of the reason is, and I wasn't prepared for it when they first started. And then I started training them. I would just say, look, when you go on the internet, it's a big, I was cautioned the same way when the World Wide Web was first started and basically first opened up, the big frontier. And my colleague Lee Green, who's now chair of family medicine at the University of Alberta, said, it's a big wide world out there, be careful. And so what I tell patients is, if it's a .com site, you really can readily discard the information as somebody trying to sell you something. If it's a .org site, it is very likely that they are pushing a particular perspective. So even like the Cancer Society is going to be pushing all things to screen for every little last cancer. It's not going to be like a .gov site like USPSTF. And it's not going to be like a .edu site, like things that are coming from an educational institution. So what I tried to do is I would steer them towards those things so that they would be able to get information. I will say that as a person with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, that it has been good for me to be able to point them to the Ehlers-Danlos site so that I could get them informed rapidly up and running, because there's so much bad information about Ehlers-Danlos out there and people commonly being misdiagnosed. And so that has been helpful. And as a matter of fact, I think because of the internet, now I've gotten myself known well enough that people who were coming in suspecting that they had EDS come to me saying, I'm coming here because so-and-so here said that I didn't have Ehlers-Danlos and I'm coming here to have you help me. And commonly I've taken a look at these people and sure enough they have the right genogram and the right phenotype, and I've sent them off to Cincinnati or other places where indeed they are diagnosed as having Ehlers-Danlos. So it's an important thing to be well armed, especially when, unfortunately, they use this term, they call themselves zebras. I don't necessarily consider myself that metaphor. But I just get the fact that people feel that way because they don't understand where they're coming from. And so it's a wonderful way to reach out to other people like you. And so I think the internet has exponentially has changed that. I don't think that Redbook or Look or Life or Reader's Digest ever had that kind of an impact. That was a roundabout answer of saying, I think it's really changed in my 35 years of practice.
And then you're saying it's a quantitative change, that this culture always been there, but now it's the majority culture. And at one point maybe it was feminists in New York or whoever, whatever a subculture would be.
And now it's on your phone.
Before it was like, before it was all phone wide, people would have to, I mean, I have some patients that are like homeless patients, and they would tell me how they went to the library to get
public
logged in on
library.
a computer.
Yep.
But almost every freaking person has a phone.
Yeah.
And you've got a mini computer that is fully capable of landing the original lunar module on the moon. So now we are able to access information so readily where all you have to do is say, explain to me what this lump in my thyroid means, and you'll wind up with 10,000 articles.
Yeah.
You can pretty quickly figure out what's going on.
Yeah. I think that definitely pointing out that part of this is not just what actual people are doing, but also what policymakers decide is okay to tell them. There really is a shift. I mean, before the 1970s, if you did this kind of Kellogg thing, you would face pushback. You would be seen as a difficult person, an un-American person. After the 1970s, I almost worry it's become too much of an expectation, and the kind of person, I mean, we're all different. Some people don't want to go and do all that research. They really want to be able to trust their physician is giving them the right advice. It's almost like we flipped the model and now made it something everybody has to do. And if you're homeless, or what if English is not your first language? Oh, please. So I worry it's been scaled up. Frankly, I'll say I think it's a kind of approach. I mean, I do it myself, but it is for middle-class, educated folk can do this kind of thing relatively easily, and we have scaled it up as an expectation for every American in ways that I think are not good and not doing right by a lot of patients.
I want to thank you so much.
On that note,